am delighted to have my friend Dr. Margrit von Braun here, and I'm so thrilled that she agreed to speak with us. She's had a very busy week, actually very busy few months with her speaking engagements. Margrit was born and raised in Huntsville, and she and I went to school together. We went to a small school. In fact, she and my husband were classmates and several other classmates here today. And it was a very happy time, lots of good memories, and we all knew each other and did things together. And I don't think we realized the magnitude of going to the moon and the complexity and what that meant to our country and to humankind. In fact, when Margrit saw the Earth, the pictures of the Earth from space, from the moon on Apollo 8, that really inspired her when she saw that view to take care of the Earth and what can we do to take care of the Earth. And she'll talk a little bit about that. We also went to Georgia Tech together. We had kind of lost touch after high school, and lo and behold, I walk into my department office, and there she is. And so we reconnected, stayed in touch over the years, and she and the Von Braun family, I invited them to my last launch, shuttle launch, and they all came to the shuttle launch. So they're very special people to me. She's a very talented, amazing scientist and engineer who just happens to be the daughter of Wernher von Braun. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you to Pastor Mulaney. When Jan invited me to this service, and I agreed to be a part of the Lunar Communion service, she then told me it meant I had to give the sermon. So she's a tricky one. One of the things Jan did that our family has been so grateful for, she took our dad's pilot license on the shuttle with her. So a little piece of him got to go to space. I also want to express our family's gratitude to all of you for continuing this Lunar Communion tradition. Today, what I want to do is share some of his thoughts on science and religion, but it won't be that simple. I'm also, because I used to be a college professor, throw in a little physics lesson, so I hope you had some coffee, and I'll certainly share some personal memories. But I have to start with a confession. It's not a recommendation, it's a confession. In the summertime, we were not big churchgoers. We had another sacred place that we went to on Sundays, and it was right here. It was Lake Gunnersville. So on Sundays in the summertime, this was one of my dad's other sacred places besides church. We would take off on the boat and go water skiing and swim, and it was probably the only hours he really took off during the week. It was known as Family Day, which meant that if we kids wanted to bring a friend along, it was a long negotiation because it was really reserved just for our family, and they were really special memories. His other sacred place, his other sanctuary, of course, was the heavens. This is a picture of the Milky Way reflected in Stanley Lake in central Idaho. I've lived in Idaho for the last 42 years, and Idaho, that part of Idaho has what's known as a designation as a dark sky preserve, which means that all of the outside lights are shielded so they don't get wasted just going up into the heavens. The lights just point down, and that means you can really see the night sky, which is getting to be quite a rare thing. In the United States, 80% of the people live in such urban areas with so much light pollution that they can't see stars, they can't see the Milky Way. On planet Earth, which doesn't all have as much electricity as we do, a third of the people on this planet cannot see the Milky Way. And I think that's pretty profound because part of what we understand about ourselves, I think, is proportional not only to how far we travel, but also how far we can see. And the heavens are such a source of inspiration that being able to see the heavens seems pretty important. My father's mother, our grandmother, gave him a telescope for his confirmation. So science and religion were really part of his life from an early age. I'm going to share, I don't know what's making that noise. I'm going to share some of what I've learned in reading my father's speeches and his other writings. My brother Peter, who's here with us today, he and I have been going through our dad's speeches and documenting them, and my brothers read all of them almost. They told us there were 200, there's really closer to 700, so it's taking a while. And we've learned so much about what he thought about lots of things. You know, as a kid, you don't pay that much attention. It just all seems normal. But he wrote a lot about science and religion. One speech that I like to highlight is one he wrote the year I was born in 1952. It's called Space Superiority as a Means of Achieving World Peace. He was a very optimistic person. We still have a little ways to go to get to that world peace. In 1976, the Lutheran Church of America in Philadelphia asked him to write on this topic: responsible scientific investigation and application. Well, he died the following summer, so this is really the last big thing that he wrote. And he said it was a daunting task. It's a pretty big subject area. He wrote 81 pages, mostly by dictation. And it has a lot of depth to it. He talks about the need for scientific research, which is not a surprise that he wrote about that, about the great curiosity we have that motivates us to do science. He wrote about morality, technology, and science. One of the quotes in this speech that I found particularly fitting was, "Wise and cautious statesmanship and ironclad international treaties are needed to protect us from the abuse of newly won scientific capabilities." True in 1976, still true today. He wrote about pollution, he wrote about genetic engineering, things that we still sort of, sciences that we still sort of struggle to figure out. And he wrote a big section on science and religion, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to read a few things from his speech because, in case you don't like him, you can blame him and not me. And they're also, I think, it's just great for me to be able to recite his own words. One of the things he said was, "Many of our contemporaries have come to believe that science and religion are not compatible, that knowing and believing cannot live side by side. Nothing could be further from the truth. Science and religion are not antagonists. On the contrary, they are sisters." So as a little aside, when I read this, and I read this speech when I was in college and I'm revisiting it now, it occurred to me that I wondered if he used my sister and me as inspirations when he described these sisters. Because while growing up, we were often antagonists. We didn't always get along so well, like science and religion. And he probably hoped that we would learn to live peacefully side by side, which I'm happy to report that we now do. Going on about this section about sisters, he writes, "While science tries to learn more about the creation, religion tries to better understand the creator. While through science, man tries to harness the forces of nature around him, through religion, he tries to harness the forces of nature within." And he talks about coming to grips with things happening in the 20th centuries, that religious leaders have to come to grips with things in the then 20th century. These are kind of funny quotes, I think. In talking about resources, he says, "Man's most precious resource, undoubtedly, is his brain. But the vast majority of mankind uses it most sparingly. The reason, of course, is inadequate education. It has been said that the Earth is a spaceship with 3.5 billion astronauts and no captain coasting through the universe to an unknown, multiplying like rabbits. While they are rapidly depleting the spaceship Earth's limited supplies, like drunken sailors, they poison their life support system as though they were implementing a global suicide pact." Well, in 1976, there were 3.5 billion of us spaceship Earth astronauts. Now there are 7.7 billion of us. And I don't think the characterization has changed too much. He said, "I believe with all my heart that religion, like science, is evolutionary, growing, changing in the light of further revelations from God." It means learning to live with the findings of Copernicus, of Galileo, and Darwin. So they were some of the folks who, way back when, provided challenges between science and religion. It requires the acceptance of change and the discarding of antiquated or downright erroneous ideas, no matter how painful. One of the people that he quoted a lot and read about a lot late in his life was Teilhard de Chardin. Now, he was a Jesuit priest who also studied fossils. So think about that, a devout Catholic who was involved in the discovery of Peking man. He was a real paleontologist. I think he was sort of asking for trouble. He was really like the embodiment of science and religion conflicts. And he really worked hard to reconcile the knowledge that was growing in science and some of the older religious beliefs. He wrote, "Love is the driving force to explain the paradox that any upward development of creation violates entropy, the second law of thermodynamics." So that's a big thing to get your arms around. So he's saying there's a paradox between the fact that creation and life on Earth is increasingly beautiful and complex, and physics, thermodynamics, which says everything is falling apart and becoming chaotic. So we're going to spend a little time on this paradox. I'll show it to you in kind of a cartoon version first, because that works a little easier. So entropy is the idea that everything sort of eventually crumbles and falls apart. Whereas this evolving understanding and beautification of creation, you could think about as the life cycle of a butterfly, starting out as an ugly little caterpillar and turning into a beautiful butterfly. So that part you're probably more familiar with than the second law of thermodynamics, so I'm going to drag you through a little physics lesson here about entropy. This is a cartoon where a mother walks into her child's really messy bedroom, and the kid goes, "I blame entropy. My room's a mess because things get worse if you don't take care of them." And this would maybe be a normal way that a normal parent would explain entropy to their child. But we grew up in the space age, and our dad explained things maybe abnormally. And I remember very vividly how he explained entropy to me when I was probably about 11, and I had no idea what he was talking about. And this is the example that he gave. He said, picture a bathtub, and half of it has hot water, then there's a dam in the middle of the bathtub, and the other half is cold water. What happens when you pull up the dam? You get warm water. It mixes together because those molecules tend toward a lower state, and we can't easily then re-separate those molecules because entropy is what draws that tendency towards chaos, or in this case, mixed warm water. Well, there's a couple of other examples to make entropy seem more realistic. One is Murphy's Law. We're all familiar with Mr. Murphy. He was actually an engineer who worked at Edwards Air Force Base, and in 1949, he became sort of like the first human crash dummy. He was trying to figure out how much deceleration a person can withstand. And in the middle of one of these tests, he realized that the technician had not wired the transducer correctly, so it sort of was a failed test, and he got out of his little buggy and said, if anything can go wrong, it will. And we all probably on a daily basis are reminded of Murphy's Law. Salvador Dali, a surrealist, said, of all the things that can go wrong, most of them don't. And I think it's so remarkable. You know, most of the day, and our human bodies are probably a great example of this, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, and a lot of them really don't. And finally, if you think of entropy as described by a humorist, Mr. Mark Twain said, most of the things that we worry about don't happen. And then there's this group of optimists. So this is my dad and some of the rocket team on launch day, July 16th, 1969. They knew all of these rules. They knew about entropy, they knew about Murphy's Law for sure, and they knew that attention to detail, redundancy, accuracy were important skills, that teamwork could overcome entropy. And that means that we can create order. We could, for example, drain the bathtub, put the dam back in, put cold water on one half, hot water on the other, We can clean the house, we can make the kid clean up the room, and we can go to the moon. So let's go back to that paradox. So remember, entropy versus the creation or the beautiful complexity of the increasing of creation. And let's go back for a moment to Teilhard de Chardin. He says, love is the most precious gift humans were given. View the world as loving and lovable. Love and charity are not just desirable virtues, but are fundamental forces in the nature of creation. So probably if I stopped right there, you'd say, wow, that's a pretty beautiful thing. But before his death, his writings were condemned by the Catholic Church. And he was pretty much disowned because he was trying in his own way to bring science and religion together with that bridge of love. And my father, in his 1976 speech, said, we should really revisit this guy because he seemed to have a pretty good idea. As Jan mentioned, the 1968 Apollo 8 mission was one that inspired many of us. The picture of the Earth that 600 million people watched the landing on the moon, but probably a lot more people by now have seen this image. It's one of the most famous images, most famous photograph in the world. And it's not a coincidence that the first Earth Day was in spring of 1970, that my first job at EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was my first job in 1975, and that was a period when all of the environmental regulations in this country started getting passed. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act were really the beginning in the early 70s of the environmental movement, because we really saw the Earth as this precious little spaceship that we're riding, and everything around it seemed pretty black and dark. And we began to realize that, as Pastor Mulaney mentioned, it looks like something that should be a peaceful place, a peaceful rock that we're riding on. And it really has led me to the field of what I like to think of as humanitarian environmentalism. So I'm going to share a little bit about my own journey. My father's, of course, was quite ambitious, getting from the Earth to the moon, and then really immediately going on to Mars. That was really his dream, and if he were here now, he would be surprised that we haven't been to Mars, but at least now we're talking about it again. My own journey started here in Huntsville, and I've lived in Idaho for the last 42 years, and right after I retired, I made a really pivotal journey to northern Nigeria. And it was one of those places I never thought I'd be, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I got there. So when we retired, I retired from the University of Idaho, where I taught for 31 years, and my husband and I also had an engineering company. Ian is right here in the front row. When we sold the company, we thought about retirement for about 5 minutes, and then we did one of those never say never things. We created a nonprofit foundation to kind of continue our work on a global scale, working directly with communities that are affected by environmental health issues, many of which are affected by mining pollution. So my own journey is quite exemplified in this picture. In the middle of this picture, there are 3 little boys in Zambia who are carrying fishing poles, homemade fishing rods, little buckets of worms, and they're going to go fishing in a little pond downstream from an abandoned smelter, a very polluted pond. And that picture, I just look at it and I say, that's what we've got to change. That's what we've got to fix. So kids are not doing that. And the picture on the right is me a few months after retirement taking dust samples inside someone's home in northern Nigeria and thinking, I flunked retirement. Happily. So far, happily. Lots of pictures of Earth that we have all benefited from. We, of course, see beautiful things from space when we look at Earth, but we also see pollution. We see air pollution, we see giant mines that have scarred the landscape. We see light pollution, wasted light that's just pointing up instead of pointing down. And it's really helped us understand and bring some priorities and attention to parts of the planet that we need to work on. So I did spend most of my career at the University of Idaho in environmental engineering and science, and was really enriched the whole time by just sharing adventures with young people. I think I came to realize pretty early into my job that maybe my most important job wasn't being an engineering professor, it was being a mentor, because I was, not surprisingly, the only woman on the faculty for a long time. And so the women engineering students were drawn to me. And at first I thought, wow, this is taking up a lot of time. And then I realized, this is probably the most important thing I'm doing here. So I was very much enriched by that. We started the nonprofit. This is a picture of us with some of our team in northern Nigeria. We did a lot of training of locals. So one of our philosophies, which we really try to live by, is when you're doing a project in another country, it's not us coming there, doing it, and leaving. That would lead to entropy and chaos in some cases. So you have to build a sustainable system. You have to train the local people to take care of their own community if they don't know how, to work with tribal governments, religious governments, state governments, federal governments, whoever's in charge, to make sure that they understand the environmental consequences of their action. So let me tell you a little bit about this story. One of the things we do a lot of is sampling of contaminants. And when you're sampling contaminants in soil, there's always a little stream of kids following around because they think, wow, grown-ups playing in the dirt. This looks like fun. Let's see what they're doing. But actually, we're taking soil samples. So what happened in northern Nigeria is regarded now as possibly the worst lead poisoning epidemic in the world ever recorded. In 2010, Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, as they're known in France, which is an amazing humanitarian organization, was working in northern Nigeria and realized that about 500 children under the age of 5 had died in the previous 2 months. And at first they thought, well, you know, this must be malaria or cholera or some infectious disease, which are unfortunately not uncommon in those parts of the world, but that wasn't it. And they sent some blood off for sampling, and they discovered that the children had extremely high blood lead levels and that they had been lead poisoned, and that's what had caused these young children to die. So they contacted us because we've worked for a long time in lead poisoning. We had a big lead smelter in Idaho and had some experience in some other countries around the world on childhood lead poisoning. And this was sort of beyond what Doctors Without Borders, who are more famous for probably Ebola than any other medical emergency organization, but not lead poisoning. So what happened was, this was really, you might say, a perfect storm of disastrous events. The first thing that happened was the price of gold was really, really high in 2010, and it has continued to be high. In fact, the price of many metals are very high. We all use all kinds of metals in our cell phones and in our cars and other things, and those metals are mined all over the world. And when the price of metals are high, very poor people do more and more desperate things to recover those metals and make money. The gold in this part of Nigeria happened to exist in colonial lead mines. So lead mines that were developed by the British when Nigeria was a British colony. And that gold had a little bit of lead in it, or the lead had a little bit of gold in it, or you could say the gold had a whole lot of lead in it. And the geologists, when we first started to dig through this situation, said that's not possible. There's not enough gold in the lead ore for that to be profitable. It just doesn't happen. Except if you're really, really poor and the price of gold is really, really high. And that was the combination. And the third part of the perfect storm was this part of Nigeria practices a very fundamentalist form of Islam where the women of childbearing age live in purdah, which means they don't leave their households. And the women were engaged in this ore recovery process. The men were doing the mining, they would bring the ore rock into the households, and the women would break up the rocks in their food containers, the same mortar and pestles that they used to feed their families. So the food chain, the entire food supply, was grossly contaminated, and it also generated a lot of dust and contaminated soil throughout about 8 villages. So thousands of people were affected. But primarily, children were affected. So pregnant women and children, especially under the age of about 2, which was the majority of the children who had died, are extremely vulnerable, not only physiologically, but also because of their behavior. So if any of you have raised a 2-year-old child, you know everything goes in the mouth. That's how they discover the world. And all over the world, rich kids, poor kids, eat dirt. We don't like to admit that our kids eat dirt, but they do. And if that dirt isn't contaminated with lead, it's really not that big a deal. But if it is contaminated with lead, that incidental ingestion of soil is how they become lead poisoned. So our job was really to identify all the pathways of exposure to that target child. It could be the food supply, it could be the bricks that they use to build their households out of, which were also contaminated. It could be the water supply. Children are involved in the mining themselves, so there's a lot of child labor there. And then there's just this incredible amount of dust and soil everywhere that's contaminated. And our job then was to break those pathways so that kids that are incidentally ingesting soil, the soil is no longer dirty dirt. So we say, give them clean dirt to eat rather than dirty dirt to eat. The job that we did to remediate these 8 villages involved, again, about 400 local laborers. Many of them were miners that we trained. And we started this project bringing about 20 people from Idaho. Some of them were for my graduate students, do all kinds of good things with graduate students. Some of them were volunteers from around the world and the country. And we started this initial training program with 20 folks from the US. Now there's 1, because we wanted this program again to be sustained locally. And I have to tell you, this is a picture of Ian and me sort of towards the end of one of those projects. This was a project that we didn't see coming in our lives, but it really profoundly affected everybody who went there. It was very, very difficult, very challenging, very moving. We met families who'd lost all their children, and we were reminded on a daily basis how people who are living in desperate places, in places that feel to us hopeless, are still full of hope for their children having a safe life on this planet. So that's kind of a microcosm story of what I think of as a bigger perfect storm. So what happened in Nigeria, sort of on the bigger picture, is the farmers and the herdsmen, who used to have a pretty sustainable agricultural existence, turned to mining because, first of all, they could make more money, but also because their grazing lands and their croplands were no longer sustainable. Because the change in our climate affects places like sub-Saharan Africa first. So sadly, the most vulnerable, the poorest people are often the ones most affected immediately when things change for the worse. And they were driven from their farm fields and from their herding existence to become gold miners. They were also had traditional tribal conflicts that go back centuries between tribal herdsmen and tribal farmers. They were extracting resources, and that combination of climate change, conflicts between groups of people, and resource extraction, in this particular case, led to an environmental health disaster. But it's happening all over the world in different ways. This year, it's estimated that 24 million people have been displaced by disasters in weather. 24 million people. And we know that number is going to go up. We know with a lot of confidence because NASA, who most people in Huntsville hold in some esteem, has told us with 95% certainty that the change in our climate is due to man-made activities. It's due to burning fossil fuels. It's due to things like changing land uses. And it's also correctable. So it's a big problem, but we know we can fix it. In fact, the best estimates are, and this is sort of an internationally recognized estimate, that if we take action now, we can fix this problem within the next 20 years. That's the generation that may find us wrong. Very good cue. 20 years is a long time when you think John Kennedy only gave us 8 years to get to the moon and back. So 20 years is a doable thing. And because we've accomplished so many great things as humans, if we commit to this challenge, which the next generation is clearly telling us to do, I know we can fix it. So I want to give you a challenge. And this picture kind of embodies some ways that you might think about taking action. So I think of things like space camp. This summer, Space Camp is going to graduate its 1 millionth space camper. Think of that experience that those kids have had, an exposure to possibility that they wouldn't have in their normal school life. Programs like that are just wonderful gifts to give to children. The picture on the far right at the bottom is a teacher. So we all have opportunities to teach, to share stories, to share knowledge. The bottom left is a more desperate picture of refugees on a boat. Think what it takes for a parent to place their child on a rubber raft to hope for something better. That's happening around the world. And the picture in the middle says, I flood and I vote. And this is a picture that's connected to a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a wonderful group. It's completely nonpartisan. They say this is not about what your party beliefs are. It involves at least 7 major religions. So it's a completely inclusive action group. It includes industries. It includes, really everybody is welcome. And the idea, it's like the open table here. Everybody, y'all come and let's just take action. It has been largely led by teenagers. In fact, the speaker at the Citizens Climate Lobby meeting in Washington 2 months ago was the daughter of a friend of ours. She's 19 years old. She spoke to about 4,000 people. Her name is memorable, so I'm going to tell you her name. Piper Christian. It's kind of an unforgettable name, Piper Christian. And you can look on YouTube, and she talks about her commitment to helping Earth become a sustainable, safe place for her future children. And she also talks about how her generation is not waiting for us to catch up. They are taking charge. And I think anything we can do to support them is something that we should be challenged to do. But let's go back a little bit to the role of religious leaders. So my dad's speech talked about coming to grips with issues of the 20th century. Now we have issues in the 21st century, and we are reminded it requires acceptance of change, discarding antiquated or downright erroneous ideas, no matter how painful. So just like we've had in the past, and some still current, people who don't believe we landed on the moon, people who believe the earth is flat, people who believe the sun revolves around them, we also have people who deny the issue of climate change. But NASA has told us 95% certainty it's happening and it's our doing and we can fix it. And we have a responsibility to fix it, because I think really the lessons of space exploration, of Apollo, of the shuttle, of the space station, have really touched our hearts. They have touched humanity. 600 million people watched the moon landing. And it wasn't just about beating the Russians, even though that maybe helped fund some of the things. We did go in peace for all mankind. And it really shows us what human beings are capable of. Those teams that can overcome chaos and destruction and entropy. We can use our God-given responsibility to protect Earth and our God-given curiosity to continue to explore the cosmos. I wanted to share with you some pictures of our father's tombstone. And I like to visit it. It's in Alexandria, Virginia, because people always leave mementos. This one has somebody left a space camp emblem and a NASA symbol. It also has written on it Psalms 19:1. And it doesn't spell out the Psalms. So when I always look at it, I think, yeah, Dad, you're still making us look stuff up and read stuff and memorize stuff. Now you have your own cheat sheet. And of course, the entire quote is, heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And Jan next week is going to speak to the Psalms. So we have a nice segue going here. People leave flags. People leave models of Saturn V, a little smaller than that one. They leave space shuttles. They leave all kinds of good mementos. In that speech, my father also wrote, the universe is revealed through scientific inquiry as the living witness that God has indeed been at work. He loved to quote what Frank Borman said when Frank Borman was asked if he had seen God. No, but I saw his evidence. So this week we've been celebrating the Apollo 11 accomplishments. And I wanted to just take a moment to remind us that celebrating stuff is good. I think sometimes we get really wrapped up into all kinds of hand-wringing and whining, and we forget to celebrate great accomplishments. This was a great accomplishment of human beings on this planet, and we should celebrate it. I was there, and I have proof. So there's a picture of me. I was in the viewing stands with my family. My dad was in the control tower, but shortly thereafter, we got to go up to the control tower, and my dad's in the middle there. I'm wearing the white hat. My mom is standing right behind my dad. And I wanted to point out, we have a special guest in the congregation here today. Dorette Schlitt is here. And in this picture, she's way over to the right in the orange blouse and the white skirt. Her husband is standing way back off in the left with the tie. And Dorette is here. She was my dad's secretary at Peenemünde. So they had a long journey together, and they were there at this very moment right after Apollo 11 took off for the moon. So it's just wonderful to see you again. We've shared many memories. All of us kids grew up together. Her two daughters are here, so we're especially blessed to have her with us here today. And this is the picture I took. Well, see back in this picture, me with the white hat, I'm holding a little brownie camera because I wanted to make sure in case somebody forgot to take a picture that I would have mine. So this is my favorite picture of Apollo 11 taking off, even though, of course, it's a terrible picture. You can barely see it, but it's sort of the memory of how I remember seeing it. I wanted to end with one more thing that my dad wrote. He was asked by Who's Who to write one sentence about his life. That's a challenge. Here's what he wrote. I pray that in my lifetime, I can help to expand man's sphere of activity beyond the confines of planet Earth, to contribute to the exploration of the worlds around us, and to achieve a better and humbler perspective of our own. Thank you very much.